It's your campus, your station, your news. You're listening to X Focus on Expression FM.
Hello and welcome to a very special News Team episode on Tuesday, the 10th of October, World Mental Health Day. To mark this occasion, we're bringing you an interview that Flo and myself, Tom, your heads of news here at Expression FM, had with Exeter's MP, Ben Bradshaw. We got the chance to speak with Ben about his views on mental health provision, specifically on support for young people in schools and at universities. We looked at what legislation a Labour government would introduce, as well as what challenges it might face. We ended on a lighter note talking about Ben's experience as an MP, as well as how he's seen Exeter change and what he hopes for the future. We hope you enjoy.
Hello everyone, my name is Florence and I'm one of your heads of news here at Expression, and we also have here with us today...
Hello, I am Tom, one of your other heads of news here at the station.
And today we are really lucky to be interviewing Exeter's MP, Ben Bradshaw. So Ben, would you like to start off by introducing yourself?
Hello there, I'm Ben Bradshaw. I'm the Labour MP for Exeter. I've been the MP for Exeter since 1997, when I took the seat from the Conservatives, and I'm standing down at the next election. So you'll have a new MP in a year or so's time.
Yes, whenever that general election does finally happen.
Indeed.
So there are lots of different things that we wanted to discuss today, and it's always quite hard to narrow it down to, get a focus. But we are airing this interview that we have recorded on World Mental Health Day. And it's something we're doing here at Expression. We wanted to mark this day by opening up conversations, not only about individual mental health, but also about the systemic treatment of mental health as a political issue. And certainly we, as students, but even widely in the public, we have more discussions than we used to, but there is still a lot more progress that does need to be made. So the first question I wanted to ask is, what has changed in the way that politicians talk about mental health? And is it an issue that politicians pay more attention to now than they used to?
Well, quite a lot has changed in the way that politicians, or most politicians, talk about mental health. But unfortunately, not a great deal has changed when it comes to the delivery of policies and care and services for people with mental health problems. When I was first elected, it was very rarely talked about mental health, and there was still a kind of stigma attached to people acknowledging fragility in their mental health. And that has changed. That's a good thing. People are much more prepared and willing to acknowledge and talk about it now. That's a very healthy thing. I think there have also been some outside impacts on mental health, particularly young people's mental health. I don't want to go over all the stuff around the role of social media and of the impact of COVID, but there has been a huge rise in the incidence of mental health. But some of that, I think it's fair to say, is because people are more prepared to acknowledge it and talk about it. Unfortunately, the quality and level of services and the funding for those services has not materialised. In fact, it's got worse under the Tories. We've had 13 years now of cuts to mental health services at the same time as a massive rise in demand. And, we had in the United Kingdom, just one statistic, our suicide rate fell consistently every year under the last Labour government. It's been going up again in recent years as a result of this austerity and the lack of services. So there's a lot to talk about around mental health. I think, we've got to the position where it's acknowledged, but I'm afraid the political commitment so far has not been there to fund adequate provision and services that people, and particularly young people, need.
Yes, and you sort of mentioned policy and mental health policy. How should this be framed? Should it be framed as a public health issue, a social issue, or maybe something else entirely, perhaps a joined up approach?
Well, of course, there are different. Mental health is a very broad church. There are some mental illnesses that are probably not preventable, and we still don't understand, their cause, schizophrenia, bipolar, and these require a sophisticated combination often of medicinal and therapy treatment. But I think there are mental health, in exactly the same way as physical health, comes into every area of health policy. It comes into prevention because we know, for example, that there are quite simple things that we as individuals can do to improve and protect our mental health. Physical exercise is an obvious one, a healthy diet, um, not allowing your phone or social media to take over your waking hours, um, and to do all those things that we know is good for one's mental health, building good relationships and maintaining those relationships. But then there are incidences in people's lives, trauma being, probably the best example, where things that happen to people at a very young age have a really massive impact in them all the way through their lives. And we've only really just begun to understand and acknowledge that and the impact that has on things like employment rates, crime, and so forth. So it's as big mental health is as big an area as physical health. And I suppose it's understandable that because we've only recently begun to talk about it in an intelligent way and acknowledge it, that we're still feeling around for the best approach. But there are certainly other countries that do it better than us and in a more integrated way. But I hope, and I won't be around in politics anyway to see this, but I hope that the next Labour government will build on some of the good work that we did when we were in government on both prevention and particularly the provision of talking therapies, which are really difficult to get on the NHS and they're really expensive in the private sector.
So you've mentioned the role of prevention. That's something that recently the Conservative government have been talking about, and they basically announced that they want the NHS to be a preventative health service. They don't want it to be accident and emergency in the way it is now. Is that a realistic statement given the current state of the NHS?
Well, it's interesting they've picked up this idea of the importance of prevention from Labour, because if you look at their record over the last 13 years, in every single year, the government has cut funding to local government who are responsible for public health. So public health funding in this country has been cut drastically since 2010. So look, I'm always grateful for a sinner who repenteth. And if that's what the government's doing, great. I just think it's window dressing. I don't think they're serious about it. It's talk and no action. And I don't think anyone after 13 years is going to believe any of that sort of stuff. I mean, if the government was serious about prevention, it would do what Labour's suggesting by providing full-time clinical psychologists in schools, for example, to help people, more support for children with mental health problems and special needs in schools. It would not have cut funding for public health. It's all very well for Rishi Sunak to talk about banning smoking, but what about all of the other behaviours that have a massive impact on both physical and mental health? Lack of exercise, bad diet, none of those issues are being addressed by the government, and I don't think people will take very seriously this sudden apparent conversion to the importance of prevention, given the government's record on it.
I'm really glad that you brought up the role of schools when it comes to sort of treating mental health problems, because that, as young people, that's something that we care about quite a lot. So radio presenter Roman Kemp recently sent a letter to the government pushing them to install dedicated mental health support teams in all schools, sort of similar to the policy you've just mentioned. Schools are not currently required to have specific policies on mental health, but they do have certain duties under the 2010 Equality Act. Now, it's very good to have this idea in theory, putting professionals into schools. It sounds like a great idea. But again, sort of similar to the NHS, is this a realistic idea given the pressure that schools are under, especially when it comes to catching up children after the pandemic?
Well, I mean, clearly you wouldn't want to fund it from the school's existing resources, and that's the problem we see time and time again with this government, is they introduce measures to require public bodies and public services to provide another service without providing the funding for it, in fact, by cutting the funding. And the good thing about Labour's policy is we have explained exactly how we would fund that policy, i.e. by removing the VAT exemption on private education. So, it may sound quite small beer, but it's really important, I think, for a government that aspires to, a party that aspires to govern, that it's quite clear about how it would fund its extra provision. And we've been quite clear that this would be extra money. It wouldn't fall on schools' existing budgets. And it would be in addition to the rest of the funding that would come from ending the VAT exemption in terms of employing more teachers, more support staff, and generally easing the overall pressures on schools that make it very difficult for them to manage and deal with these problems in an effective way.
So alongside the sort of budgetary constraints, but you've sort of mentioned how you'd get the money for that, there's also the issue of training. And if you're going to put such sort of individuals within schools, you have to make sure that they're properly trained and equipped to deal with all of the different scenarios that students face. How would that training sort of be done? Would that be sort of through NHS professionals, or would it be up to the schools to train them? Where would these people kind of come from?
Well, you've got me there. I can't quite remember what the training path is for mental health support staff, but I would imagine you'd have to have some kind of qualification which would involve some level of mental health nurse training. I mean, you couldn't just let anyone loose on young people, because obviously that would be unacceptable and risky. And one of the problems that your question has highlighted is we have a massive workforce problem in the NHS, in social care, and in schools at the moment. Schools can't recruit enough teachers and staff because teachers can often earn much more working in the private sector. We have a chronic shortage of healthcare professionals in mental health, particularly because it's very challenging, and the job has become more challenging as the case numbers have risen and the budget cuts have kicked in. So this would have to go hand in hand with a workforce strategy to fill all those unfilled vacancies that we currently have in our NHS, including somewhere like Devon, which you would think, well, Devon's a nice place to live and work. But even somewhere like Devon, we have real difficulty recruiting enough staff. So that is something that would have to be tackled at the same time.
So school, for a lot of children, it can be quite difficult times, perhaps if they find exams and assessments quite difficult. Rishi Sunak, in his conference speech, sort of announced the change to how he wants post-16 education to work by removing A-levels and sort of replacing them. Is a more assessment, exam-based focus really what children need, or should we look at wider reform to the education system?
Well, I think we have to wait and see the detail of what Sunak is proposing, and of course, it's not going to happen for another 10 years, even under the timescale he announced yesterday. And I mean, I think you're right. It needs to be part of a fundamental look at how we do education at secondary level. I mean, why keep GCSEs, for example? I mean, a lot of education experts say that GCSEs are completely pointless. I agree that our A-level system is too narrow. I mean, I've always thought it strange that uniquely as a country, young people in England, of course, this doesn't happen in Scotland, young people in England are forced to specialise in just 3 subjects at A-level, rather than continuing with a broader curriculum. As someone, for example, who studied foreign languages at university, I feel very sad about the way that foreign language has been squeezed out of schools and out of A-levels because of this. So I think that bit of it is good, but I think it needs to fit into a broader reform which gives equal value to skills and technical learning and qualifications as it does to academic. If that's the idea behind it, and if it's coupled with proper funding, enough teachers, and a reform or abolition of the GCSEs as well, then it may well be worth looking at. But I think I've grown so cynical of the promises made by this Tory government, because they've made so many over the years, and none of them have happened. And so I would just treat anything that they say with a very large dose of salt.
And then Ben, sort of on that, sort of it's evident that in a Labour government, mental health generally, and also as we touched on in schools, is a highly important thing and something that definitely want to be focused on. I mean, on that, in a world where next year of election, a Labour government is formed, where do you see on the priority list mental health provision in schools, to be talking about also more widely, is on the list of Labour priorities, and sort of what is the day one thing that would be done by a Labour government, would you see?
Well, I think the fact that we've made this funding for better mental health provision in schools and the increase in the number of teachers and support staff, one of our flagship policies, and being quite clear about how we would fund it, I hope would show that this will be a priority of the next Labour government. We haven't come up with an awful lot of policies, and I think that's a good thing. I think that it's a mistake for parties always to come up with a large, long list of policies, attractive or otherwise, that the public don't think you're going to be in a position to deliver. And that was one of the problems with Jeremy Corbyn, of course. But I think the fact that, one of the very few policies or missions that we've already adopted is this one, I hope would show that the Labour Party will be committed to this and committed to prevention more generally, but not a kind of pick and mix prevention. I mean, prevention, ill health prevention is far broader than stopping smoking. The way we design cities, the way that we make it easier for people to travel actively, to walk, to cycle safely, the way that we make it easier for people to make healthy food choices when they're shopping, the way we provide natural environment and reduce air pollution, all of these things fit into a programme of a major major public health revolution in the United Kingdom. The government is that on smoking, but it's not doing any of this. So our history, whether it's a smoking ban or seatbelt legislation, there's always been resistance to government action to improve public health. But in the end, no one has ever suggested after the measure has been taken to reverse it. And that's what I hope the next Labour government will do. It will be far more ambitious and far more far-reaching than what we heard from Rishi Sunak at the Conservative Party conference this week.
So, in line with that, when Keir Starmer organised his latest reshuffle, the position that was sort of the Shadow Minister for Mental Health is no longer within the Shadow Cabinet in the same way, no longer part of the Cabinet portfolio in that manner. Is this a negative thing, or is this perhaps just a different approach to treating mental health in government?
No, I wouldn't read too much into that. I mean, I think what Keir was doing in that reshuffle was not only getting the best people in the right jobs in the run-up to the election so that, the Labour Party looks like a government in waiting, but also reducing the number of shadow ministers because he had too many. And it also followed a reorganisation of Whitehall departments. So we had a situation where the Labour front bench were not mirroring government ministers, which doesn't work because, as I'm sure you appreciate, you have to have ministers in Parliament who shadow their government equivalent. So I wouldn't read anything more than that into it. And I know from my conversations with Wes Streeting and Liz and the rest of the mental health team that they are absolutely committed to this, but not only committed to this themselves, but it's a cross-government commitment, because a lot of the policies that we'd need to adopt, like the ones that I just outlined, are not just about the health service or social care or the education system. They're about the environment. They're about transport. They're about housing. The fact that I mean, one of the things that I don't know, you'll know better than I, that must weigh a lot on young people's minds and give them concern and anxiety is the prospect of not being able to afford their rent or a house because it's just become completely unaffordable. So the approach has to be a holistic one. It has to be across government, and I'm absolutely convinced that Keir and his team recognise that.
So if everything goes according to the polling and these arguments right now that Labour will win the next election, would it be a good idea to introduce the idea of a Minister for Mental Health that's been floated by various commentators? Would that sort of facilitate this joined-up approach, or would it be more sort of token signalling to the idea of addressing mental health whilst not really looking at it in the same way?
Well, there is a shadow minister for mental health, and there will be a minister for mental health in the Labour government. They're just not in the cabinet in their own right, shadow cabinet in their own right at the moment, and that's because you can only have so many cabinet places. And I think that also misses the point I was just making, which was that you could have the best and the most effective minister for mental health in the Department of Health, But if they don't have buy-in from their ministerial colleagues in other departments, nothing happens. Because A, they have to persuade the Treasury, B, they have to persuade all the other departments to make their policies, to test their policies when it comes to mental health and public health generally. And I think that's what we need to do in government. And you probably weren't even born when this happened, but there was probably one of the most significant pieces of work on public health written in our generation by Sir Michael Marmot, which was commissioned by the last Labour government, which made a whole lot of sweeping recommendations, many of which we implemented. But a starting point for the next Labour government would be to go back to those. It's not very complicated, but it does require a culture in government which is not siloed and is joined up. So I wouldn't get too concerned about job labels of individual ministers. It's about whether the government as a whole is cognizant of the challenge and understands that all of its policies need to be mental health proofed or public health proofed, if you like.
Yes, yeah, that will make sense. So something that has been a very big area of discussion at the University of Exeter, but also within Expression, was sort of after the death of Exeter University student Harry Armstrong, a national campaign was launched by his family and other supporters calling for change in the way that universities deal with mental health. This proposed change was called Harry's Law, and it would make it mandatory for universities to publish suicide statistics, and with the possibility that universities could be put under special measures by the Department of Education if there are failures in this area. So there was a parliamentary petition. It has been discussed, but ultimately nothing really came about from it. Do you think that implementing Harry's Law would be a good part of a strategy for Labour?
Well, I certainly think that universities need to be much more cognizant of and responsible for this problem. I mean, it is difficult when you're dealing with human adults, who are, they're autonomous. They're not children anymore if they're at university. But you do have a duty of care, and I think particularly to those first year students. And I sometimes worry, and I've had personal conversations with the Vice Chancellor about this around wishes in first year at Exeter University to support people and publicise the services that are available. And all too often, the university seems to be passing on its responsibility of care to our local statutory services, which are already overwhelmed. I was on the Health Select Committee a few years ago when we published a report on suicide prevention. We decided to do the inquiry because, as I said earlier, suicide rates are going up now for the first time for decades, and we were quite critical of some universities and the way that they dealt with these cases. But these things are complicated. You don't necessarily know how good a quality of relationship that young person had with their parents. Their parents might be part of the problem, if you don't mind me saying so. Not always, but sometimes. So it's very difficult for universities to know how to tackle this. I think if we had adequate mental health provision in the community, then it wouldn't be such an issue. But I think the problem in cities like Exeter is we don't have adequate mental health provision, and the presence of a university and thousands of young undergraduates leaving home for the first time, some of them finding that quite difficult to cope with, puts huge additional pressure on those services, and they simply can't cope.
So as students, should we be looking towards the university and sort of pressuring them to support mental health services, or should it be more of an issue we're trying to lobby government for in terms of encouraging institutions to actually follow these ideas, because right now most of it is all voluntary?
I think it's both. I think it's not an either or. I think both universities and government have a role here, working together. And local services as well. I know from my work with Exeter Women's Refuge that they a lot of their work is with young students, Women's Aid, who've had problems at university, which the university either hasn't managed to deal with, or the student doesn't feel that the university has dealt with them in a satisfactory way. So it has to be a partnership. But I think the message from Harry's law and from your questioning is that universities can't wash their hands of some responsibility for this.
In your experience, has Exeter University been successful at working with local services, or is this perhaps an area that they need to work on?
I think in general, overall, Exeter University has, in the time I've been the MP, managed its relations with local services and bodies pretty well. It's not always an easy relationship between university and local statutory institutions. There have been a few examples, however, and I'm not an expert on the quality of the Exeter mental health services such as they exist, or counselling services, but certainly when it comes to women's safety, I think perhaps the university has not taken that issue seriously enough in the past, which did temporarily lead to a breakdown in relations between the university and Women's Aid, which actually helped facilitate a rapprochement and a rebuilding of those relations. So I hope that's still a relationship which is working well. But I mean that in a way is a role of an MP, is not to get involved and interfere in every tiny matter. But if there's something that one hears on the grapevine, or somebody approaches and says it's not working well, I brought the university and women together and use. But on the whole, I think the university has done pretty well. I mean, there are always tensions and difficulties in relationships with large, powerful universities and the local community. But overall, I think Exeter has benefited hugely and mutually by the presence of the university, and I've certainly tried in my time as MP to try to make sure that those relations have been cordial and mutually supportive.
One thing you touched on in your response there was talking about there sort of needing to be that communication between the university and the city and sort of wider mental health services. I mean, in its current state, the University Wellbeing Service operates on a 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. Monday to Friday service, and so out of hours they do direct students who are in an urgent mental health crisis to other agencies and other organisations, whether that be NHS or otherwise. I mean, as I said, you spoke about there needs to be that continuity between the two, but do you see that the university should be perhaps putting more funding, more resources into mental health support, or actually do you think that at university, although you're at university, you're only at university for 3 years, and so you do need to perhaps utilise and adapt what resources are in the real world, because when you graduate, you then may not have those resources available to you?
Well, look, I think that's the question really that probably you're better qualified to answer as students and service users. I mean, I don't know, for example, how to what extent the opening times that you just described are common across the university sector, whether there are other universities that do better. I know one of the arguments that I used when I was facilitating the discussions between the University and Women's Aid were best practice by other universities. So, I'm sure if there were examples of better practice in other universities in terms of provision, then that is certainly something that either the Guild or I, as your MP, could help lobby for. But it really, I suppose, it really goes back to the where we started, which is, people in universities are adults. The question is, how far are universities responsible for the health services? Because they're not, they don't get taxpayers' money to fund health services. They get taxpayers' money to fund people's education, and how much responsibility should be left to the local statutory agencies. And I think what we've got at the moment is we've got a mixture. And if the balance, if the local statutory services are being overwhelmed out of hours, and there are other universities that provide 24-hour cover or longer cover, for example, then that is exactly the kind of issue that the Guild and or your local political representatives could push on. But I don't know the answer to that question. You probably in a better position to know that, or the Guild is.
Earlier on, you mentioned sort of social media and social media pressures being a factor that often does contribute to poor mental health. And it is often being said that young people's mental health is negatively damaged by social media and other online platforms. The government recently passed the Online Safety Bill, which covered a myriad of topics. But it also meant the fact that social media companies now must have a block mechanism and must give users greater ownership over the content they view. Does this go far enough to tackle online trolling? And do social media companies actually have their users' well-being at heart?
Well, I think we have to wait and see how the app works in practice. I mean, we supported the legislation in as far as we went. We think the government could have gone further in terms of making chief executives responsible, criminally liable, for example, and subject to very, very large fines. But it took a long time, this bill, to get through Parliament, and you'll be aware of the discussion around encryption and the technological barriers at the moment to handing over access to encrypted platforms to statutory authorities. It's very difficult to design a system that does that without letting bad actors in. So I can understand why the government didn't want to take that step. But if and when the technology changes, I think that is probably the next thing that needs to happen, because none of us want our private messages to be accessed by anybody we don't want. But on the other hand, sometimes in order to protect people, statutory authorities do need those powers. And the question is finding the balance in that system that enables that to happen without compromising people's privacy.
When it comes to talking about young people, it's very often that people, blame social media for all of the problems that young people face. Is this, an easy out, sort of blaming social media and its consequences for young people's problems, or does this go to the heart of wider issues, social issues, such as not being able to afford housing, poor education, things like that? So basically, is the government wrong to just blame social media for young people's problems?
Well, in fairness to the government, and I'm usually its sternest critics, I don't think even the government is blaming all young people's problems on social media. And I think you're right. I think it's a lazy knee-jerk response to the increase in mental health problems. I mean, I think it's pretty incontrovertible that mental health and the screen time. It's a bit like telly. I mean, when I was growing up, my parents strictly rationed the number of hours that I was allowed to watch telly, and I'm really glad they did, because I found if I ever binge watched television, I kind of felt a bit depressed, a bit slothful. Felt much better if I went out and had a walk, or went and did some sport, or met some friends and had a chat. So I think you can there's sensible messaging around this, but look, the challenges facing young people are not caused by social media. The challenges facing young people in Britain are caused by the fact that their future's been taken away from them by this Tory government. I mean, you've had Brexit, you've had cuts to student support, you've had cuts to support for sixth form education, you've lost your access to the European Union to work and study. All of the fiscal measures that this government has taken in the last 13 years have been designed to protect and even enhance the living standards of the generally older and wealthy, as opposed to the less well off and young. The government have presided over a housing crisis, which means that housing is without the reach of most young people who don't have rich parents. So look, it might be convenient for the government to try to blame social media for the challenges that young people face with their mental health, but it is largely responsible for a lot of those challenges. Social media might not necessarily help, but it's certainly not the cause.
So just to finish up our discussions on mental health before we move on to some perhaps more light-hearted questions, some people are saying that we are currently in a mental health pandemic. Do you think this is an accurate phrase, or does it possibly risk fear-mongering?
Yeah, I think that's probably overblown. I mean, there have been moral panics a lot in the past, haven't there, about all sorts of things, about the invention of electricity and the motor car and nuclear energy and the advent of television and now the advent of social media. And the issue with social media is you can't undo it. I mean, I think what's happening is that you know the rate of technological change and progress is so rapid now that it's been very difficult for individual governments and societies, but also global governance to keep up and to regulate. And I think with good regulation and a much more hands-on approach to prevention and mental well-being by government, we can get on top of this. But I think we're going through one of those periodic periods when a new technology develops so fast that we haven't developed ourselves social and regulatory frameworks to help us manage that new system safely and for the good of people's mental health rather than for its detriment.
So earlier on when you were introducing yourself, you mentioned that you won't be standing at the next election. What are you proudest of achieving whilst you've been Exeter's MP?
Oh dear. Well, I suppose party politically turning Exeter into a Labour seat from a Tory one, which is a legacy I'm proud of. But I think probably in terms of Exeter, it's the transformation we've seen in the quality of our secondary schools, our state secondary schools. When I was first elected, they were really poor, and Exeter College wasn't great either. And thanks to the investment and reform under the last Labour government, we now have 5 brand new high schools. Exeter College is one of the best, if not the best, in the country. And that means that the real life chances of thousands of people who've gone through Exeter's school system in recent years has been significantly improved. And I think that's probably the most useful thing that anyone, any politics can deliver. I mean, on the national stage, I think the huge strides we made under the last Labour government towards LGBT equality and inclusion, and I worry that we're going backwards now under this government, particularly when it comes to trans and non-binary people. But yeah, we swept away the whole tranche of discriminatory legislation in government, and obviously I was the first openly gay MP to be selected and elected, so I have a particular personal interest in that. And although the Tories, are trying to take us backwards now on trans rights and equality, no one is seriously suggesting at the moment, although I wouldn't rule this out, that they do so on lesbian and gay rights and equality. So that is a reform that I think has become embedded, I hope, for the long term.
Reflecting a bit more widely about Exeter more generally, how would you say in your time, say since 1997, how would you say Exeter has changed? It was, obviously when you took office, when you took office, the university was a lot smaller than it is now. In 2012, university joined the Russell Group in Universities Institution, and since has grown a lot more. You've seen a lot more accommodation in the city. So what do you sort of, how do you see that's changed? Also just more widely in the city of Exeter, aside from the university, how have you seen it change since you first started?
Well, I mean, in summary, Exeter has been transformed from a sort of fairly sleepy, small provincial city with a middling university into the economic powerhouse of the region, southwest of Bristol. I mean, the Exeter has regularly now come out top, or at least in the top 10 of cities for growth and improvements in productivity. The university, as you say, has expanded. The city itself has become much more diverse. It was very mono-ethnic when I was first elected. It's become culturally more interesting, and we have attracted a lot of public and private inward investment, and that has helped provide more well-paid, secure jobs for local people. One of the big problems that we used to suffer from was a brain drain of graduates. There weren't many job openings for graduates in Exeter. That has improved significantly. So, yes, I mean it's been a positive story for Exeter over the last 25 years or so, and I think Exeter is very well placed, in spite of the negative impact of Brexit. Exeter is very well placed to continue that growth, and green growth as well. We have the potential now to become the kind of model zero carbon city in the country if the right decisions are made, and that can only be good for local people and for our local economy.
So, as you're stepping down, what priorities do you think your successor should have, both sort of within Exeter as a constituency, but also broadly representing the region and within Parliament?
Well, I think Steve will bring a fresh mind and a generation leap to Exeter, which I think is a very good thing. I mean, one of the reasons I decided to stand down is I think it's very important to recognise when the next generation might have more to offer than you do. He's very experienced. He's very bright. He's very talented. I think he will build on the positives that we enjoy in Exeter, but he will also, I hope, work with the next Labour government, if we're lucky enough to have one, in addressing some of the really, quite serious social problems we have, such as homelessness, poverty, lack of some of the services we've just been talking about on mental health, but also on substance abuse services. And I think address some of those issues which, in spite of Exeter being, a nice, economically strong city, make people feel concerned and unsettled by the deterioration of the public realm in the last 13 years or more. So I think he'll have a macro role, obviously, in Parliament in supporting the Labour government get its legislation through, but also I hope focusing on addressing some of those issues that have been built up during the Tory years that have led to a deterioration in the public space and in our public services.
So the final question I wanted to ask was in relation to this Labour government that everyone has now come to expect. In your from your experience, what do you think is the biggest challenge that this Labour government is going to face if it does get into power?
Well, firstly, I think it's a real mistake to expect it, and particularly for young people to expect it, because one of the things that really worries me, it goes back to the Brexit referendum, is that if young people had voted in the Brexit referendum at the same rate as older people, Brexit would not have happened. But far too many young people either didn't think it mattered, or they didn't think that Leave would win. And my worry is that if you suggest that most young people now expect a Labour government, that they'll think it doesn't matter to vote. It really matters to vote. It really matters to register to vote. It really matters that you know that you can register to vote both in Exeter and in your home city. You can't vote in both places, but you can choose where to vote in the general election, and that could make a difference. So first thing is, no complacency. Young people must be registered. Universities and the Guild have a huge role to play here. And we must fight this idea that it's going to happen anyway, because it only happens, we'll only get a Labour government if people vote for it. The biggest challenge that the Labour government's going to face is the complete disaster that it's going to inherit from the Tories. It's a much, much worse economy than we inherited in 1997. The country is broken, nothing works. So the challenges that Keir face are going to be enormous, and the expectations are going to be very high, which is why I think it's really important that between now and then, he does his best to manage those expectations and make it quite clear to people that we're not going to be able to create a paradise overnight, that it's going to take at least 2 terms of a Labour government to begin to repair the damage caused by 13 years of the Tories. That would be my message.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for answering all of our questions today. It's been so great to have a conversation with you and just sort of get you onto Expression, because you actually haven't been interviewed by us since 2021, I believe. So it's been quite a while. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Very nice to talk to you, Florence and Tom.
And that is the end of the exclusive interview with Ben Bradshaw MP, brought to you here on Expression FM. It's understandable that the topics we discussed in today's show may have been distressing. If you'd like to talk about it, you can call Samaritans on 116 123 24 hours a day, or email the University of Exeter's Wellbeing team at wellbeing@exeter.ac.uk. If you missed any of today's interview, you can listen back by searching for Expression FM News wherever you get your podcasts. Our coverage of World Mental Health Day will continue tomorrow on X Focus. Do join us 5 to 6 p.m. live here on Expression, where our panel discussion will have topics on mental health.